So predicting environmental conflict remains aspirational, as both environmental change and conflict dynamics are complex and emergent. While links between extreme weather and conflict exist, they are indirect and highly context-specific. Conceptual tools and frameworks help distill these pathways, guiding problem diagnosis and intervention design. This panel showcases these approaches that facilitate early warning, intervention opportunities, highlighting how such tools can interrupt pathways toward conflict and support proactive peace building. And we're joined by 3 scholars from the Global Water Security Center, which is housed at the University of Alabama. And from the left to right, first we have Penny Beams. I'll introduce them generally, then I'll go individually. Penny, Caily, and Penelope are human environmental analysts at the Global Water Security Center at the University of Alabama. They examine how water and environmental disturbances affect the social conditions to produce instability at the national and regional levels. At GWSC, Penny on the left here, her work has focused on Russia, Asia, and Oceania. Previously, she worked on hydropower in the Mekong Basin and nature-based solutions in Asia. Penny holds an MES with a focus on transbound root rivers and analysis geography with a focus on systems at the global scale. Caily's GWSC work has focused on water security issues in Africa and the water energy demands of U.S. data centers. Previous research has examined drought monitoring and impact assessment in U.S. systems, with an emphasis on biophysical conditions and socioeconomic consequences. Schwartz holds a PhD in natural resource sciences from the University of his work at UWSC focused extensively on lots of challenges in the Middle East and Latin America, illicit agricultural systems, and transboundary water. Her prior research focused on the opioid epidemic as a complex spatial problem. She holds a PhD in geography from the University of Alabama. So before we begin, I just ask that we hold all questions for the panelists until the very end. So I'll read them just to make smooth transition to the presentation. We'll have plenty of time for lots of interactive dialogue and questions from the audience, both in the room and on Zoom. So without further ado.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Alex. Much appreciated. So I'm Penny. I'm going to kick us off with an introduction to Pathways to Instability framework. So this is what we use. We've developed it at the Global Water Security Center as a linear tool to, in some ways, render the complex just complicated. And in order to find entry points, early warning signals, generally mapping these indirect links from water to conflict. So the kind of prevailing knowledge is that climate change, or not prevailing knowledge, but like prevailing rhetoric is that climate change is going to cause more conflict. But I think we all know that it's not quite as simple as that. We understand that social and political conditions can influence whether climate impacts will lead to conflict. We have come to understand that antecedent conditions play a substantial role in whether conflict will erupt, the contours of that conflict, and what we might be able to do in order to head it off. So lots and lots of researchers have described the layered links between these antecedent conditions and forthcoming conflicts. We've got lots of causal loop diagrams, deep models, but at the Global Water Security Center, our main clientele are military professionals and people from the intelligence community. We present them with a causal loop diagram. They say, yeah, cool, tell us what's going to happen. So they tasked us with coming up with a tool that would take all of these complex problems and turn them into something a little bit more linear. So we developed the Pathways to Instability framework. It's a streamlined, flexible model that can point to interventions and hopefully, in some cases, even give us early warning. Framework. I am not going to dwell on this for long because it's a very complicated slide, but this is kind of what the framework looks like. What's happened? Flip. The more compressed version of this, though, is we've broken it down to the biophysical components of the water to conflict pathway and the social. Put in a different way, it's what happened and how do people feel about it. We also take the position, do you want me to go back? I saw photo, I saw the cameras going up. We take the position that conflict is a collective action problem. So it's not that necessarily that, say, a drought or a flood causes conflict. It's that actors can mobilize and leverage the impacts of those water disturbances in order to create or manifest conflict. So we take a very specific look at the actors involved. Some of the pathways that have emerged in the work that we've done are things like rebel recruitment, that shows up a lot. So in the Lake Chad Basin, one of the pathways that emerged was if you've got flooding and you have an antecedent condition of, say, weak institutional frameworks, you don't have a lot of flood control, then you get grievance over ineffective government response. People feel like they should be taken care of and they're not. And then violent extremist organizations can leverage that grievance and they can recruit people with an offer of protection and even retribution, depending on how people are feeling about it. Kyrgyzstan, super interesting water problems there. The way that this showed up there was instead of VEO recruitment, we got a coup. So there were low reservoirs and it created livelihood impacts. And the way that that was leveraged was the opposition groups could say, there's corruption in the government, they're not managing your water well, support us and we can overthrow the government and install ourselves instead, which is what happened in 2010. Mexico, oopsie, oh well. But in Mexico, Penelope's going to get more into this in a little bit, but this is a bit of a teaser. Again, we've got water scarcity issues that cause livelihood impacts, and then the different actors and the way they seek remedy for those problems will turn into different pathways. So we may have the same event kicks things off, but the way people interpret and respond to those phenomena will determine different conflict or instability outcomes at the end. A lot of what inspired the pathways are similar pathways that show up a lot in the literature. One of the pathways that shows up a lot in different formats is this flood to unrest. I've got some citations up here. They are obviously non-exhaustive. If you have more, we're like squirrels when it comes to information. Give us more, we will take it. But this flood to unrest idea shows up in a couple of ways. So if you've got a flood and you've got limited institutional capacity, so say you've got more displaced people, that could cause more riots. If you've got heavy impact from that flood, it could lead to more protests. If you have different groups feeling like there is inequality in the government response, say one racialized group or ethnic group is seen as getting more assistance or protection than another, then that can start to cause conflict. And ultimately, the antecedent systemic condition that oversees all of this, if you've got, one of the things that was found is if you have more democracy, you get more protests because it's seen as a legitimate way of expressing your displeasure with this lack of government response. Or again, we can go back to this floods and VEO recruitment. And what shows up is if you've got people losing their farms, losing their homes, by joining a VEO, they could be spreading out their risks. So maybe you've got family members that stick to farming on whatever land they've got left, and others who join a VEO in order to have a financial insurance plan. Or you've got people who see this as a broken social contract. So they're disillusioned by the lack of government response, and they join a VEO as a means of rectifying that problem. Socialized marginalization, we've got outsized impact. People are seeking protection, so they may join a non-state violent actor group. Our research plans are to take what we're seeing in the literature or what we're seeing in our work and what we see come up in literature and see if there is a finite number of pathways to instability, or maybe are there certain factors that matter more than others? Like, we're seeing overlaps in our work and the more academic literature. Is there something to that? We know that water disturbances that cause damage to agriculture or industry, other ways that people's livelihoods get impacted, they might be seeking ways to rectify those problems, or they're just really angry, which is a totally legitimate human response. Or we see on the biophysical side, things like, did anybody see the Valencia, Spain floods from about a year ago? The response to that was intense. But then there were thousands of people protesting in the streets, but then you can contrast that to, say, the floods in the Camp Mystic in Texas, where you had a similar, very outsized impact, but not the same kind of protest response. So what are the antecedent systemic or social conditions that are different that produce those different results? And we also want to look at the social conditions, like, are we looking more at individual impacts, or are we looking at collective impacts? Like, there's a ton of really fascinating literature on betrayal, humiliation, like these emotional responses and how they contribute. Or another branch of the literature that's looking at horizontal inequalities, this more sort of widespread collective issue. Are there ones that stand out more than others? So far, all of this is anecdotal. We have not necessarily approached this with academic rigor. So we know that in order to really dive into this, we're going to have to test against counterfactuals. So where are situations that present maybe a similar set of ingredients, kind of like this Spain versus Texas comparison? And see, like, where are these differences, and can we do this in a rigorous way? Penelope will get to that in a little bit. And then following on that, if we can find these common baskets of conditions, but also a subset of meaningful differences, can we reveal opportunities to intervene? And what that looks like in the pathways is, maybe we've got people who are developing flood resilient infrastructure, and so they're tackling the more biophysical side of the pathways. So if we don't have the same kind of flood impacts, maybe there are fewer grievances for actors to leverage further down the pathway. But we can also have crop insurance. One of the things that comes up a lot is drought. This sort of gravity well of, water scarcity leads to conflict. But if you have an institution that can offer crop insurance, farmers feel like they're being taken care of, their livelihood isn't as impacted, they don't have as much grievance to leverage later on. Working more on the social side, we've got cross-cultural social solution building. People who feel maybe that their identities are different from their neighbors can have a shared water problem. That can be used to build a sense of commonality across groups. Or if you've already got people fighting, the diplomacy conflict resolution route. So that means that there are multiple ways to intervene, to show up and build before these climate impacts start to happen, or perhaps after they've already led to conflict. And they are all very complementary to one another. They might be different, they might look different, have different people, different approaches, but ultimately they all complement one another. And then in terms of the early warnings, again, if we understand this mix of biophysical and social conditions that tend to present these kinds of outcomes, can we develop a watch system? We talk a lot about horizon scanning, but again, we would need to understand better the counterfactuals in order to just not point at everything. Like, a lot of this is like, oh, if there's water scarcity, people are going to fight. Like, how do we drag ourselves away from that narrative and get a more nuanced understanding, so we're not just saying, like, oh, it's dry, people fight. Drag us away from this environmental determinism that is kind of like captured a lot of people's imaginations. And because we work a lot with climate and forecasts, is there a way to match these two temporally very different systems? So we're operating on a similar geography, say a place like, I find the Philippines super fascinating because they have this very complex governance structure. They've got all of these different like independents and insurgent groups, like super nuanced area that also get hit by a lot of cyclones. Like, is there a way to layer both these very slowly evolving social patterns with something as temporally emergent as a cyclone and develop a system where we can see the negative outcomes coming before they hit? Brings me to the end of my intro on the pathways to instability. This is the paper that we published in Environment and Security last June. It's been just about a year now. And that set the stage for all of the work we're doing. Caily and Penelope are going to get deeper into case studies and where we want to go next. And I will pass the floor to Caily.
Great, thanks, Penny. I will be talking about critical minerals in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC. My name is Caily Schwartz. This was in collaboration with our data scientist, Dr. Erin Menzies Plural, Nicholas Roberge, Emma Dyson, Penny, and Penelope as well. So I'll go through some background. Critical minerals and mining. It's a pretty hot topic. There's a lot of conversations around it. Give some background and antecedent and systemic conditions of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and then go through two pathways of how we think about using the framework within our work at the Global Water Security Center. The word cloud on the right is just to show how intertwined with a lot of different sectors critical minerals are, but the mining and the supply chain, it impacts kind of the whole of society and the environment as well. So it's a really long definition of critical minerals from the World Resources Institute, but the main point or main part of this definition that I think is important is that they're defined as essential to countries' economies or development. So they're found in everything from clean energy, semiconductors, different aspects of military machinery, and different aspects of that operation, and also medical devices. So that's right now, there's a lot of conversations around critical minerals and mining because we don't know exactly the rate of demand and how that's going to increase with the clean energy transition and electric vehicles. But also recycling technology can impact the new mines need to be developed if recycling technology and that opportunity improves. The IEA estimates that you could reduce new mine development by 40% for copper and cobalt and 25% for lithium and nickel. So that could save some areas from having mines come in if there's more recycling. So for this presentation, the supply chain of critical minerals goes from extraction to the end-use manufacturing, but I'm going to talk about extraction, so where these mines are and where mining takes place, and the impacts on the land and the people around mines. This is a diagram one of our cartographers created to show what this could look like in different aspects of a mine. Different ways to mine. You have underground mining, surface mining, which is typically what you see when there's a big open pit with that's kind of bare land. And then we also really wanted to make sure that the tailings ponds got onto this diagram because that is where kind of the toxins and the excess material that aren't the minerals end up. And that area is, when it breaks, causes a lot of pollution to your air, water, and soil. So we wanted to show that because that's a huge environmental impact when or if that disaster happens. Critical minerals are found globally. This is the US Geological Survey's selected mines and deposits. So this doesn't encompass everything, just that data set's selected mines. But with this, you can see that they're across the globe in all continents. So what are the benefits of mine? I've talked about pollution and big mines that come in on the land. They can bring economic opportunities, which include jobs and income. They sometimes can bring infrastructure development to an area that didn't have that before. If the mine needs more energy, that doesn't always translate to benefiting the community around it, but sometimes mines do bring infrastructure. And then on a broader scale, it could be a way to diversify economies in a country. But with the opposite of that, mines can bring a lot of issues and risks. The picture on the left is the broken tailings pond in Zambia in 2025, which created an environmental disaster and has still seen long-term health impacts from that pollution spread. So the pollution from these mines is a big issue and risk. With the corporate mines that come in, you're competing for water, land, and energy with the local communities. That could lead to displacement or deforestation. And then mines can also increase health risks in child labor. And then with both the benefits and the risks with mines, who owns the mines does play a large role in that. It's kind of case specific of how that mine's operating and what governance there is with to manage the risks that mines could bring. So one type of mining, so I've talked a lot about the industrial mining. So another type of mining is this artisanal and small scale mining. It's typically described as informal or illegal, labor intensive, and using handheld tools. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there's about estimated 2 million artisanal miners. This is viewed as a substitution for farming, or could be an additional income with farming. So maybe mining in the off season, but a way to have more income. And then globally, there's about 50 million estimated artisanal and small scale miners worldwide. And this again, to support household income. So I'll go through some antecedent conditions and then go into two different pathways, the artisanal and small scale mining versus large scale industrial mining, and then artisanal and small scale mining to non-state armed groups. The DRC also is, in Eastern DRC, is currently having health and conflict. I don't talk a lot about that in this presentation, but it is important to note that those are occurring. For this presentation and this research, I'm looking at the Fragile States Index just to get a kind of a broader overview of antecedent conditions that could be playing out on the ground, kind of at that broader country level. The red areas indicate increased vulnerability to state collapse. With the Fragile States Index, they identify 3 variables that are leading toward this higher vulnerability in the DRC. The first is stress from refugees and IDP, so the higher pressure upon the state caused by forced displacement. Demographic pressures, which could be food insecurity, it could be like urban to rural migration, could be their population growth as well. And then also fractionalized elites comes up as hot, like measuring high in the Fragile States Index. So high stress and division along different ethnic, class, clan, racial, or on like social side and perceptions of mining, that could influence social conditions across DRC and across different countries as well. But in the DRC, mines tend to be viewed as an economic opportunity or diversify income. That's always the case globally, that mines are viewed that way. So that's when looking at different places, that's an important consideration. And then also there's corporate social responsibility programs when industrial mines come in, but those tend to rely on local organizations for implementation, and that can be lacking in areas in the DRC. And then the Congolese Mining Police was also recently funded and began as a paramilitary force to provide security for these industrial mines, with the thought that more security at the mines could bring additional mines and more economic opportunities within DRC. So looking at the pathways, we tend to start the pathway with a water disturbance. For this, we're looking at heavy rain days as a proxy for flooding. And we found with our data scientists on the team that heavy rain days are projected to increase across the country. So the darker blue are more days above the 2010 number of days. So the dark blue here is about 22 extra days of heavy rain. So the possibility for flooding. And then the yellow dots are from the USGS data set. So they're selected mines. This isn't representative across the country, but those are the selected mines from the USGS data set. We're looking at flooding and asking how can flooding exacerbate tensions in communities with mines, and how can mining contribute to the impacts felt by flooding. So kind of my leading hypothesis and thought with using the pathway are that mining disrupts these social ties and increases grievances against the government when these mines come in and impact the communities through pollution and competition for different resources. And that could also increase distrust amongst communities. And then you have extremes like flooding that can occur. And then the associated impacts with those events can deepen these tensions and influence longer-term instability. So there's like a lot going on with mines. You have ownership, you have where these mines are, how they're built, how they're governed. But we're using these pathways as a way to simplify this and to communicate how you could have a flood and a mine in a similar spot and how that could impact communities and the environment around. So in the pathways, we start with this biophysical, what happened. So for both examples I'll show, I start with flooding, how that can impact infrastructure, homes, fields, and roads. And that could lead to lost revenue, diminishing livelihoods, so that turn toward artisanal and small scale mining. Then kind of what happens after that. So how do people feel about that is very nuanced and context specific. I'll use the pathways to kind of try to communicate different intervention points for different situations. So the first example is artisanal and small scale mining, and then this industrial large scale mining, and using the pathways to kind of show how that could cascade through a system. One study estimated that 30 to 50% of mining related conflict is between artisanal and small scale miners, and then the industrial mines. So starting with the flooding, lost revenue, these environmental pressures can affect people's lives. Some antecedent conditions are that when there's artisanal and small scale mining, that typically indicates a mineral deposit. So those miners have found where this mineral is, and that could provide an opportunity for commercial mining to come in since there is a mineral there. These large scale mines disrupt artisanal and small scale miners. It disrupts the community. There's competition for land as well. So that could lead to opposition groups forming, and then violent protests. This lack of regulations and social safety nets can create opportunities for conflict and violence when violence feels like the best option for better conditions, especially as small scale miners may get pushed out, since these large scale mines come in with a lot of money and resources to be able to mine in an area. Again, the mine ownership also influences outcome and how artisanal and small scale miners may or may not be able to continue mining. So in this situation, and trying to communicate different opportunities for peace building with industrial mining, a lot of these reductions in the intention to fight are reliant on mining companies to support local communities. That's not always the case. In the DRC, there's a lot of Chinese-owned mines that can bring in their own employees and miners, so they don't necessarily need the local communities or they don't need to employ those local community members, which then that could also create tensions when there's no other form of economic opportunity or no replacement for that artisanal small-scale mining. Then leading into the next example, the artisanal and small-scale mining into non-state armed groups. This is also very nuanced and a lot of different ways that this pathway, when you dive into it, could form. So I'm going to give a kind of this big overview of how we think about communicating these different pathways. So the non-state armed groups may create violence outside the mines if the non-state armed group controls the mine, which creates this sense of safety within their mine to keep miners wanting to mine there because it appears safer than going outside. Prior experience of violence in household and social dynamics can influence adolescent recruitment. So if you're exposed to violence, can influence how the pathway plays out. And then social inequalities and unequal access to natural resources can also increase grievances. So there's a lot of different dynamics here that can be layered within this pathway. So again, starting with environmental pressures affect people's lives, the flooding, turning to this artisanal and small scale mining, and like lost revenue. The lack of government response and oversight with the lost revenue and different opportunities to continue your livelihood. That could lead to grievances, especially with unequal access to these opportunities. Like when a large scale mine comes in, those artisanal and small scale miners get pushed out. The non-state armed groups can leverage this grievance to then recruit and create a stronger non-state armed group. So yeah, these existing grievances and unequal access can create these opportunities for these groups to take advantage of. But like starting with all these different dynamics, even simplify this pathway is still complex. So thinking about this as a way to communicate kind of big picture, some possibilities, and then each case is, you can dive in deeper to see how that plays out. So in this, I'm using the pathways as a tool to identify intervention points at a higher level. They help to communicate possible starting points, especially as kind of doing an in-depth conflict analysis to understand these points in a specific context. What has worked in the past, what hasn't. Considering local context, the capacity of local organizations is also super important. And then as we think about disasters and flooding, the management of disaster risks also closely involves local organizations. So this all really ties together. So we're using the pathways to try to identify different areas that could cascade through the system. I'll pass it to Penelope, who will continue some case studies in illicit agriculture.
You, Caily. So hi, I'm Dr. Penelope Mitchell, also a human environmental analyst with the Global Water Security Center. And yes, I'm going to be talking about environmental stress, how that relates to illicit agriculture, and then some peace building opportunities within this problem space. And this work was created in collaboration with colleague Dr. Erin Menzies-Plur, who did the environmental data science work within this. And then our cartographers, Nick Roberge, Zach Goodwin, and Emma Dyson contributed to the maps and visuals in this presentation. So our roadmap, first, we're briefly going to touch on agricultural hardship, specifically looking at how our changing environment is contributing to agricultural hardship and how some people are coping with illicit agriculture. We'll look at illicit agriculture using our framework. And then we'll do a deep dive looking at Afghanistan and Colombia, working through the pathway with more specific information. And then we'll conclude with some implications for interventions and future research. So first, agricultural hardship is not new, but what I want to focus on is how changing environmental conditions are shifting the zones of crop suitability in some places. So specifically thinking about extreme precipitation, increased incidence of drought events, or vice versa, increased incidence of heavy rain events, and chronically rising temperatures that are pushing crops beyond their thermal range. This can affect crop yield quantity and quality, which in turn trickles down to livelihood impacts, as declining yields mean shrinking incomes, and this overall deepens hardship in regions with a large proportion of subsistence and smallholder farmers. So in some places, people are coping with illicit agriculture. And when I say that, I'm talking about the cultivation of crops used to create illegal drugs. So for example, coca to make cocaine, poppy used to create opium, and cannabis, which is marijuana, just for example. And so you may be wondering, well, how is it that people are able to grow these crops if environmental stress is preventing them from growing their legal crops? And that's because these crops happen to be very hardy. They can withstand a wider range of environmental conditions, higher temperatures, drought conditions, and floods. And in addition to that benefit, many of these have a shorter growing cycle. For example, coca, you can get several harvests a year. And so with these benefits, people are using that as a coping mechanism because you can get higher, quicker, and more reliable returns. And so in dire situations, that can be an economic lifeline. It can also serve as informal credit, as many drug trafficking organizations, militant groups will help people set up. They offer informal credit systems to help people get established in this illicit economy. In addition to that, an important consideration is that the byproduct of growing these crops is a relatively non-perishable and compact product versus crops that have to be transferred to market, perhaps on damaged roads in a quick way before they are before they rot, or if they get damaged on their way to market. So the fact that it can be compressed down like opium paste can be a brick stored in your house for over a year, and you can pull that out and use that as money. It's a very useful thing to have in a very unstable environment. And so with that, as environmental stress narrows the illicit agricultural options, there's this higher incentive to participate in this illicit economy. But this is not a neutral coping mechanism. You know, we can see this is the environmental stress is affecting people's lives and livelihoods, but there are negative byproducts to this, and it's a multi-scalar problem. So first, this environmental stress increases the opportunity structures for non-state armed groups to recruit growers and laborers. This becomes a symbiotic relationship as the farmers benefit from this income and the non-state armed groups benefit from selling the product. They gain money and power. So that's an important relationship. And then overall, this illicit power can work to undermine the state. It can entrench violence in the communities and cause wider regional instability. People can exit the system through migration or crop substitution programs. This is not always a viable opportunity, and so this pathway persists. Additionally, the drugs created in these producer regions are supplied into these transnational drug supply chains. This creates instability and violence in the transit and destination settings. So that's problematic, but then also this contributes to broader public health harms as drug supply fuels abuse. And we have issues with widespread drug use disorder and overdose mortality. And reducing these health issues is an explicit government health priority in many nations. So this is a problematic pathway that could become more problematic. So we're zoning in on this to think about how is this problem space changing. It's important to note that this pathway obviously is not deterministic. This environmental stress does not automatically mean that a place is going to turn to illicit agriculture. What's important to know is that it's the environmental stress interacting with the political, the economic, the social, security context on the ground to create this pathway. And what people are not necessarily talking about, it's not well researched, is how this environmental stress can deepen the structural conditions that are sustaining these illicit economies and further entrench this relatively intractable problem. And then with regard to interventions, a central implication here is that interventions that don't take into account these changing environmental conditions could be increasingly ineffective and maladaptive. Another important consideration is the antecedent conditions that lead to this problem space in a particular area. How did we get here? What is the path dependence leading to this outcome? It's really important to understand this because in this illicit agriculture pathway, this is often classed as a development problem. But as we dive into Afghanistan and Colombia, and we'll work our way through the pathways, we'll see that development kind of got us to this problem. So development needs to be designed very carefully, and so we'll get into why. So first, I want to dive into the antecedent conditions in Afghanistan, and I'm going to walk you through a timeline. This is not exhaustive, it's a single slide. So this is a very generalized history hitting key points that are meaningful to illicit agriculture's presence in Afghanistan today. So looking back at opium in Afghanistan, this was not a culturally significant crop in Afghanistan. It came about in the 1800s. There was a historic opium pharmaceutical export market, and this was only occurring in these 3 provinces that are highlighted on the map here. But around mid-century, 1945, as World War II ended, the US and Western countries were pushing anti-drug policy. And so the US encouraged Afghanistan and the League of Nations to implement this opium poppy ban and squash this pharmaceutical export market of opium. And so Afghanistan, their king at the time, was very interested in development and wanted to partner with the US. And so they implemented this poppy ban so that they could continue to trade and collaborate with countries around the world, particularly the US. But shortly after this ban is put into place, the Helmand Valley Development Project is initiated with the US, creating this nation-building project in Afghanistan with the idea of using seeds instead of bullets to fight communism, to prevent the Soviet Union from encroaching in Afghanistan. So the US sent the same engineering company that developed the Hoover Dam over to the Helmand Valley in Afghanistan and built a large dam and irrigation infrastructure as they were going to make the desert bloom. So this was great in theory. However, the policies that were coming out of Kabul were not aligning with the people in the valley. They had moved nomadic populations into the valley, and they were encouraging them to farm. These were difficult. This was difficult farming on marginal lands despite this infrastructure. And people were getting upset with the Western values that were being pushed upon them in this development project. So by 1955, this project starts to unravel. And the people in the valley start cultivating poppy, as this is a way that they can, generate money and power so that they can assert themselves and push back to the leftist policies coming out of Kabul. This is an article from 1956 in the New York Times just talking about this lesson in foreign aid policy and this failed development in Afghanistan, us trying to create a Tennessee Valley Authority through this Helmand Valley Development Project in Afghanistan without aligning to their cultural values. So as the US left with their tail between their legs, the Soviet Union moved in. Again, there was misalignment between urban and rural values. There's a lot more to this story, but the Soviet and Afghan war begins in 1979. And what's important to note here is that war creates an excellent space for drug cultivation and drug trafficking due to lack of state presence, due to high demand for drugs from the soldiers, and then just the ease and the ability for trafficking routes to work through the country. So then shortly after that, we have the US invasion, 2001 to 2021. Again, poppy cultivation thrived in the region. And so the desert ended up blooming, but not in the way that it was intended to. The development project was leveraged to create this poppy epicenter in the desert. So after the US pulled out and the Taliban takes power, they implement another opium poppy ban in 2022, seeking, in an effort to seek international legitimacy. And they're doing this in a place that has now become a narco economy. Poppy represented 9 to 14% of their GDP in 2021. This map is showing the density of poppy, percent of cultivated land that is poppy in Afghanistan. And you can see this red right here. This is the Helmand Valley. The Helmand Valley became the global epicenter of poppy production, supplying 40% of global opium supply in 2022. And this is in an environment with widespread poverty and an agricultural economy. And the Taliban's plan with this ban is to have wheat be the substitution crop. So now let's think about this substitution plan in our changing environment. So we're going to look at biophysical stress in Afghanistan and how that may affect this plan. So if we look back in history, looking at our historic climate data, the Helmand Basin has warmed an average of 1 degree Celsius from the 1985 reference period to the 2010 reference. And it's projected to warm an additional 1 degree Celsius by the 2035 reference period. This is using the middle of the road warming scenario. And 1 degree Celsius may not seem like a lot, but this can mean more extreme heat days. And so, particularly, rising summer temperatures can damage wheat. And temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius or 40 degrees Celsius and above inhibits photosynthesis of wheat. In the Helmand Valley, days above 40 degrees Celsius are projected to increase by 24 days in arid hot zones, which is most of the basin. So reaching nearly 90 extreme heat days annually by 2035. In addition to this, they have to deal with irrigation falling short at critical times due to lack of consistent water availability that impacts wheat yield, quality, and quantity. And so this figure is showing you annual precipitation going back to the year 2000 out to 2020. And it's showing the deviation from the 2010 mean. So basically it's showing you below and above average years of precipitation. You can see precipitation in this valley is pretty variable. And in years where the yellow bars stretch down pretty low, these have severe drought damages crops and causes widespread issues of malnutrition and hardship. Whereas the years with above average, there's widespread flooding that causes hardship. So it's a difficult environment. And so we also have the issue with warmer temperatures leading to decreasing snow days. Warmer temps can lead to premature and faster snow melt and just less snowfall in general. If we look at the Helmand Basin over time, this chart is showing the Helmand Basin looking specifically at the boreal mountainous zone where snow falls. And we're looking at the percentage of days with snow, starting with the historic reference period, looking at 1985, 2010, and then looking at the projections of 2035 and 2016. And so the 1985 period is the dark blue at the top of the rainbow, and the time chronology goes down. So it's 1985, 2010, 2035. You can see that the days where snow can fall is decreasing because of temperatures increasing. So this can mean less water stored for summer as snow and less water for irrigation. So thinking about this with the primary and secondary impacts, you see that rising temperatures mean more extreme heat days, less chill hours, and so this can be detrimental to key illicit crops. And warmer winters could mean less snow, which could exacerbate summer irrigation shortages. So what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan right now? Thinking about actors, grievances, and current instability. An armed group, the Afghanistan Freedom Front, has launched operations against Taliban authorities. This photo is from last month from the BBC, as locals grievances are building with the locals as there's pushback over poppy eradication. And we've established that poppy helps build and maintain power, and that environmental stress improves the opportunity structures for poppy cultivation to take hold. Next, we're going to pivot to Colombia and see how the history of Colombia compares to Afghanistan, and again, pull through the pathway here. Colombia does have a cultural history with coca, and and a small pharmaceutical export market that ended around the same time as Afghanistan's. But that's by no means comparable to the current coca industry in Colombia. Important things in this story are how the coffee economy, the smallholder coffee economy, really took off in the 1800s, and it became critical to Colombia's economy. A civil war took place between 1948 and 58. And what's important to know here is that this war was fought mostly in the countryside, and it displaced hundreds of thousands of people, and in the end created this deep rural mistrust of the state. After the war, there was this push for a state-sponsored agricultural development. So the state sponsored this frontier development at the frontier between the Andean Mountains and the Amazon rainforest. The problem with this was that there were so many people who wanted to be engaged in the program. There were more people than capacity, but they accepted everyone. They moved everyone to these marginal lands, and then the state presence just evaporated and people were left on their own. So what did they do? They used coca cultivation to survive. And so these areas became coca strongholds. In 1964, the Colombian armed conflict begins. And what's critical to know here is that people who were, brought up on these marginal lands or, had to deal with this hardship are many people who were fighting in this conflict. And then in addition to this, we think about the symbiotic relationship between drug cultivation and conflict and how it benefits the farmers to grow the coca, it benefits the militant groups to traffic the coca. So again, it created the ideal conditions for coca to persist. But this is not homogeneous over the landscape in Colombia. Going back to this coffee economy, this was really important, and it acted as an insulating, protective area in these places where the coffee economy was thriving. In these areas, there was strong social cohesion, high living standards. There was coffee institutions that embodied the state. They were doing great, despite having conflict around them. But an important policy change happened in 1989 that it was the collapse of the International Coffee Agreement. And what's important to know here is that it took power away from the coffee growers and handed it over to roasters and corporations. And so after this policy change, the coffee economy contracted dramatically in Colombia. And so this protective factor of this great coffee economy started to diminish. And with that, coca began to encroach in these areas as these high incomes and this that buffered hardship of participating in the agricultural economy became diminished. The peace accords took place in 2016, and we know this is a very dynamic situation that's unfolding still today. But importantly, the National Crop Substitution Program was part of these peace accords. And the aim here was to eradicate coca cultivation from Colombia. And this substitution program has been deeply flawed and has caused a lot of issues that has led to violence. But what I want to focus on is biophysical implications and thinking about coffee as a substitution crop for coca. And so this map is showing, it's a map showing coca and coffee cultivation using data from 2024. The green areas are areas with high coffee cultivation, and the blue areas are high coca. The purple regions are areas of both, where there's high coca and coffee. Thinking about the economy, coca was estimated to be 5% of the GDP in 2023, and coffee at 1%. It's important to understand that coffee bean quality begins to degrade above 24 degrees Celsius. This map is showing an increase in days above 24 Celsius using contours. This is under the more intensive warming scenario, SSP 585. And under this warming scenario, by 2035, over 80,000 hectares of coffee production area could see an annual increase of over 100 days over 24C. And so these rising temperatures could be really detrimental to the fragile coffee economy here. And areas where there's both coca and coffee could start to see this push towards more coca as it becomes an economic lifeline. So key points with the primary and secondary impacts are that rising temperatures and extreme precipitation that I didn't go into detail with, but does occur, threaten coffee production and increase rural hardship and can further entrench coca cultivation in the region. So on the ground, what's happening now with actors' grievances and instability? Right now, Colombia's illegal armed groups have increased their membership to over 27,000 members. During the peak of the armed conflict with FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces, their troops, they had 20,000 people. So now they have 27,000 people currently, and they're recruiting children and teenagers. And this, as grievances continue to build. So armed groups are mobilizing. Again, we've established how coca helps build and maintain this power, and how environmental stress improves the opportunity structures to push coca. So thinking about the intervention points here, I want to note how climate stress is narrowing the solution space in this problem. It's important to acknowledge. But we still need to reduce the opportunity structures for these non-state armed groups to push coca. So what can be done? Development and expansion of access to heat and drought tolerant crop varieties will be very important. Creating policies that help stabilize the market, such as how the coffee agreement used to do in the 80s, or diversify economic opportunity in these regions will be very important. But we need to be cognizant of the antecedent systemic conditions and not push top-down policies on areas where it really should be bottom-up community participation, so it aligns with cultural values. And then same goes for the crop substitution programs. They need to be heat and drought tolerant crop varieties, and there needs to be a market. And so this slide is highlighting how, we've talked about this illicit agriculture pathway, stemming from how the environmental pressures are affecting people's lives and livelihoods. It wasn't just one flavor of instability, and this could be nested under the larger illicit economy problem. People are participating in, illicit gold mining, piracy, logging, water trafficking. Environmental stress increases the opportunity structures for these illicit economies to sustain themselves. And so future research, as Penny said, a lot of this is, anecdotal work just from working in these problem spaces. And so we want to test our pathways, do a comprehensive comparative analyses, referencing Tobias Ide, has done a lot of work, methodological work talking about this. So leveraging that knowledge, doing some event coincidence analyses, qualitative comparative analyses to start looking at, what recipes really equate to, when the pathway holds, when it breaks, what are the mechanisms that mitigate or exacerbate these issues and why. Thank you.